Good evening, everyone. I am Professor Nancy Sinkoff, the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and Professor of Jewish Studies and History here at Rutgers. Many of you know me because you have had the good fortune already to hear me introduce myself twice. This is the third session in a three-part online course being offered by this semester's Arresti visiting scholar, Dr. Noam Sienna. And have been so happy to have him here, even though the semester's just begun. We are already bemoaning the rapidity with it is going, and certainly with how quick this extraordinary course has been so far. As I said, today is the third session. The title is, and you see it on the screen, um, Jewish visions of modernity in North Africa and the Levant, or Judeo-Arabic books and Jewish modernity, as part of an overarching course, Jewish books in the Islamic world. And by books, we mean texts and printing and other things as well. You know the drill. I think it's a webinar style. You are all muted. If you have questions, and we've gotten some fantastic questions from all of you, please put them in the chat. Dr. Sienna will pause at around 7:25 or 7:24-ish, and I will reappear and I will ask questions from the chat from you. So please put them in the chat, or any questions you might have had from last week or the week before. Closed captions are available on your screen. Click the CC button or the three dots. Also know, as I think you do, that this is being recorded and you will be able to revisit the course and or share it with other people. It will be on the Bildner Center website. Um, as I said, Dr. Noam Sienna is the Jerome and Lorraine Aresti Visiting Scholar for Spring 2026. It is such an honor for us at Rutgers to be able to invite people of Dr. Sienna's caliber, and we've had so many fantastic visiting scholars in the last 25 years. I recently looked through the list, and I'm just so pleased with what we've done. And also, we allow scholars a stepping stone in terms of teaching and public outreach, things that really help build their careers. And this is so vital. And so I want to thank you all who support the Bildner Center, because this is the kind of programming we can offer for free because of your support. As you know, I think if you've attended the first two sessions, Dr. Sienna is a scholar of Jewish book culture in the medieval and early modern Islamic worlds. He is the proud author of a newish book, Jewish Books in North Africa, Between the Early Modern and Modern Worlds, which came out with Indiana University Press. And he's currently working on a study of the first Hebrew press in the Ottoman Empire. Dr. Sienna is also an artist, a book artist, a calligrapher, a scribe, paper maker. Just last night with students at Hillel, he did a paper making workshop and print workshop in honor of the upcoming Jewish Festival of Trees, aka Tu B'Shvat. They had a fantastic time. And his artistic practice marries with his scholarly erudition. There's a way in which the haptic, the doing, the making, the materiality of what he does as an artist informs the way he thinks about the Jewish past, how people actually made things, did things, printed things, carried letters from here to there. So it's all quite, I wouldn't say it's exactly seamless, but there is a conversation between the doing and the thinking. And we have been, so honored to have him here. So I'm going to turn the session over to Dr. Sienna. I will disappear and I'll see you all in about 22 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for what a really beautiful tribute to my work. I feel very honored to be here, to have the opportunity to share my work with the public, with students, with faculty, with colleagues here at Rutgers through the Bildner Center. I'm so grateful for this opportunity for this semester of the Aresti visiting scholarship, and to Dr. Sinkoff and to Karen and Robin and everyone who has supported this so far and over the coming months for all of our programming. So it's really been just good things after good things. Thank you all for joining me on this course. Welcome back, or welcome, I don't know, anyone maybe here for the first time. I hope you have enjoyed this. Please continue to follow up with questions and feedback. I've enjoyed hearing from many of you. You can send your feedback to the Bildner Center and they will pass it on to me. So our final session of this course tonight will explore how Jews in North Africa writing in Judeo-Arabic tackled some of the questions facing the Jewish world in the 19th century. And our background will be the social, political, and technological transformations from the early modern to the modern period. So for the first part, we'll sort of set the stage for the context for what we'll be talking about, and then after our break, we will look at a few examples of Judeo-Arabic writing from the 19th century. So what I want to say first overall is that this material is taken, as you heard, from my new book, which came out this past summer. So there it is. You can see it. You can order it from Indiana University Press. If you are so inclined, you could check it out from the library. If this whets your appetite for more, or if you want to follow up, all of the material that I'm talking about tonight, you can find in this book with footnotes, with citations, and you can read it at your leisure. So please let me know what you think if you check it out. So some background. The first thing to say is that when I say North Africa, or when I talk about North African Jews, I'm referring primarily to the Jewish communities of the modern day countries of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, as you see on the map. This region as a whole is called in Arabic the Maghreb, which means the West, because it's the westernmost part of the Arabic-speaking world. So I'm going to alternate tonight. You'll hear me say North Africa, North African Jews, and you'll also hear me say Maghrebi Jews, the Maghreb and Maghrebi Jews. Those are synonyms. The Jews of the Maghreb are a mixture of Sephardim, Jews originating in Iberia, like we talked about last week, exiled at the end of the 15th century, and, for lack of a better term, indigenous communities, Jews who have lived in North Africa since the early medieval period, at least in many cases from even before the Arab conquest, as far back as the Roman period. There were some pockets of Sephardi communities in the Maghreb, especially in northern Morocco, who spoke their own dialect of Judeo-Spanish, called Haketiya. But for the most part, the Jewish communities of North Africa, both the Sephardi communities and the local communities, quote unquote, indigenous local communities, primarily spoke Judeo-Arabic as their native language in various regional dialects, so Moroccan Judeo-Arabic, Algerian Judeo-Arabic, etc. And as we talked about in the first session, written phonetically in Hebrew characters. So everything we're going to see is going to look like Hebrew, but it's going to be vernacular North African dialects of Arabic. In the period that we're focusing on tonight, which is the second half of the 19th century, much of this region was under European colonial rule. Algeria was invaded and occupied by France in 1830 and formally incorporated as a département of the French state in 1848. Tunisia was technically a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, ruled by leaders who are called beys of a sort of de facto independent dynasty until 1881, when it became a French protectorate. And Morocco, similarly, was an independent kingdom, but with heavy colonial presence from both France and Spain, especially in the north, until it too became a protectorate, split between France and Spain in 1912. So one of the key features that we're going to see tonight is the complicated position of Maghrebi Jews balancing between their own communities, their Muslim neighbors, European colonial administration, and their Jewish co-religionists in Europe. They participated in a transnational conversation on the pages of books, journals, newspapers, and pamphlets produced across the Mediterranean and beyond. So let me say now a few words, about the print industry in the 19th century. and the Jewish print industry in particular. Although printing was still a laborious and complex process, it was far more industrialized and commercialized than the small-scale, hand-operated presses that we talked about last week. You can see here this image of a 19th century Italian Jewish printing house, the Treves brothers, the Fratelli Treves in Milan. So you see on the left-hand side the composing room for typesetting, and on the right-hand side the press room with large motorized cylinder presses. And this image is from 1884, so it's a little bit more modern than some of the earlier 19th century material. But this is essentially when you look at a 19th century press room, you can see an incredible explosion of industrialized upgrades in technological possibility. And so all of these new technologies for typecasting, for papermaking, for printing, for binding, all contributed to a very rapid expansion of the possibilities for distributing printed material around the middle of the 19th century. At this time, the major center for Jewish printing in the Mediterranean was the Italian city of Livorno, sometimes called Leghorn in older English texts, a port city in western Tuscany with a very large Sephardi community. There was also a significant Maghrebi Jewish diaspora within the Sephardi community in Livorno. By the end of the 18th century, North African Jews made up around 15% of the city's Jewish community, and they owned 43% of its Jewish commercial firms. So there's a very, very significant Maghrebi expat diaspora community living in Livorno. Unfortunately, I've looked for years. I have not been able to find an image of one of the Jewish printing houses of Livorno, so Milan is pretty close. So this is what we're looking at. Jewish printing was one of the main industries of Livorno, certainly for the Jewish community. Well over a dozen Jewish printing houses operated in Livorno in the 18th and 19th centuries, and many of them specialized in working with Maghrebi clients, producing books destined for the North African market in Hebrew, but also in Judeo-Arabic. The very first printed Judeo-Arabic book had actually appeared in Amsterdam in 1737, but not very much after that. Judeo-Arabic literature did not really take off in print until the early 19th century, when it started being produced in Livorno. And Livorno is really the center. There's a few books that are printed in Amsterdam, but really starting in the late 18th, early 19th century, Livorno becomes the center of Judeo-Arabic publishing. And you see here some examples of different books with Judeo-Arabic. One printing house in Livorno in particular deserves special attention. The business of the famed philosopher, rabbi, and publisher Elia ben Amozeg, or Eliyahu ben Amozeg in Hebrew, who was born in Livorno to Moroccan parents in 1823. He worked as a publisher as well as an author himself, and he devoted much of his catalog of the books that he published to Maghrebi books, and particularly to books that upheld his own philosophical beliefs about Jewish modernity in an idiom aimed at the Mediterranean Sephardi world. And we can see this starting from his very first book off his press in 1854, which you see in the top, a new Judeo-Arabic translation of the Chumash. So it's printed by bilingual edition, page by page, Hebrew on the right, Judeo-Arabic on the left. This was a new translation which attempted to standardize and modernize the Torah's traditional rendering in Judeo-Arabic. And this philosophical orientation continued throughout his work until the very final publications of his lifetime in the very late 19th century, which were the work of Maghrebi intellectuals who were composing contemporary responses to the changing world around them. And you see some examples on the bottom there from the 1880s. In fact, Livorno, I argue, served as something of an incubator for the training of Maghrebi authors and intellectuals who began their careers as editors or correctors in the Jewish printing industry in Livorno in the 1850s and 60s, and would go on to apply their skills in the burgeoning Jewish press of North Africa in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. So, for example, two of the authors that Ben Mosig published, Eliezer Farhi of Tunis and Shalom Bechash of Algeria, and you see their work from the 1880s on the bottom. Both of those figures went on in the following years to open their own printing houses in Tunis and Algiers, where they pioneered the publication of historical, political, and ethical literature in Judeo-Arabic in the 1880s and 1890s. These works point to a growing Maghrebi Jewish readership for Judeo-Arabic material, beginning in the middle of the 19th century, and an ongoing conversation mediated through print about the relationship between the Jewish tradition and what it meant to live in the modern world. Over the following decades, these conversations were continued and expanded through the growth of the Jewish printing industry in North Africa itself. Jewish printing in the Maghreb itself began in the autumn of 1853 when a shaliach, or rabbinic emissary from Ottoman Palestine, named Chaim Ze'ev Ashkenazi, partnered with a local Algerian Jew, Yaakov Cohen Solel, to open a printing house. And you see here their first book, a Judeo-Arabic liturgical pamphlet, Seder Havdalah Bil Arabi. Ashkenazi went on to co-found two other Hebrew presses over the following decade, one in Oran in 1856 and another in Tunis in 1861, which we'll talk about later. Over the course of the 1870s and 1880s, another half dozen Jewish presses opened across Algeria and Tunisia, and in the 1890s in Morocco. These presses operated also as not just publishing houses, but also as bookstores. So you would go to the press also to buy books, and they were selling both their own material that they printed and also books and other products that they imported from elsewhere. And they had quite a lot to sell, especially material in Judeo-Arabic, vernacular Judeo-Arabic, called by its speakers Al-Arabiya Dialna, our Arabic, or Al-Arabiya Al-Barbariya, Barbary Arabic, Barbary being an old term for North Africa, or most often and most simply Al-Yehud, which of course just means Jewish. In a 1907 catalog of Tunisian Jewish publishing, a French scholar named Youssef Vassel listed over 500 bibliographic items in Judeo-Arabic, all printed in Tunis since 1880. So just from 1880 to 1907, just in the city of Tunis, over 500 bibliographic items were published, including original compositions in Judeo-Arabic, translations of European literature, for example, Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which you see in the middle there, Le Comte de Monte Cristo also, translations of Hebrew, scientific, and Maskilic literature as well. And let me just put an asterisk to define Maskilic, meaning relating to the Haskalah, the movement for Jewish enlightenment, which had already taken up considerable steam in Europe from the beginning of the 19th century. Some of the Judeo-Arabic books being published here are large tomes, multi-volume sets. Some are small booklets. Some are being released serially, chapter by chapter, for people to collect and bind on their own. And some were even just single sheets, as you see. Maghrebi Jewish writers also contributed, in addition to books, also contributed to a large number of Judeo-Arabic weekly journals, newspapers. By 1900, there were 10 Judeo-Arabic newspapers that had appeared in Algeria, 2 in Morocco, and a whopping 23 in Tunisia. Many of these newspapers also included serialized novels as feuilletons, meaning a supplementary portion of the paper devoted to cultural and literary entertainment. And you see the dark line that goes across the bottom of the page there. Underneath that line is the feuilleton. For example, in 1890, Masoud Maharik translated Avraham Mapu's 1853 Maskilic Hebrew novel Ahavat Tzion into Judeo-Arabic under the title Kitab al-Hub wal-Watan, the Book of the Love of Homeland, which appeared first as a feuilleton in the Tunis-based journal El Bustan, and then at the end of 1890 was published as a standalone book in 3 volumes. So the distinction between newspaper and book here is a little bit fuzzy because many books themselves began as parts of newspapers. So the final observation that I want to make before our break is that when I look at the landscape of print culture, I'm not just thinking about books as singular concrete objects, right? They're moving in and out of different forms, different media like newspapers. And in addition to books, printed ephemera like booklets, journals, posters, and cards, in other words, material that's meant to be read but then discarded after it's served its purpose, temporary printing, is central to Judeo-Arabic publishing, both from the side of the presses producing it and from the side of the consumers. And we can see this is what we might call job printing, because you print it by the job. We can see the importance of job printing for Maghrebi publishers, for example, in the advertisements for presses and bookstores, and one example you see on the left. When a press, such as Jacob Gedge's press in Algiers, is advertising the range of its products, look at what they're advertising. They're saying they produce books in Judeo-Arabic, in Ladino, in Muslim Arabic, but then they emphasize, we serve anyone who needs to print books or journals, letters, envelopes, business cards, address cards, leaflets, or brochures. So that's all ephemeral publication. And you see some examples of such things on the top. This was the economic base that supported the larger, expensive book projects. It provided clients with personalized printed material, with the ability to share news, with cheap, plentiful, and constantly changing reading material in the form of pamphlets, booklets, song sheets, feuilletons, etc. But unfortunately for the historian, ephemera generally survive at an inverse proportion to their prevalence. The more popular a leaflet or brochure is, the more that it's likely to have been read and discarded, or read and passed around until it falls apart, while it's the larger and more expensive and frankly less read books that sit preserved on bookshelves and make their way into libraries and institutional collections. And furthermore, until recently, ephemera were not always considered particularly important to collect or archive for their historical value. And given that there's a very low scholarly interest in modern Judeo-Arabic generally, the fact that any Judeo-Arabic ephemera survived from the 19th century is pretty miraculous. While we must recognize that we're aware probably only of a very small percentage of what was originally published. So with that caveat, let me take a break. I'll be happy to answer some questions. Feel free to stretch or get a drink, and then we will dive into some examples of 19th century Judeo-Arabic publications.
Great. Thank you so much. We have quite a few questions. It seems that we have a surfeit of Davids asking the questions tonight. We have multiple Davids or Davids or Davids or whatever. So let's start. One of our Davids asked, why are some of the books published in what he considers Rashi script? So first you're going to have to tell people what that is for those who don't know, and how, Rashi is usually associated with medieval Ashkenaz. So how is his script getting to the Maghreb?
Okay, so you can see an example here. The first smaller image has you can see a large title in square script. That's kind of the familiar printed Hebrew script. And then the smaller text is in, let's call it Rashi script for now. We can see also here in this example.
There you go, yeah.
So the first thing I'll say is Rashi script is something of a misnomer. Rashi never knew this script. This is a style of handwriting that's based on Sephardic semi-cursive script. In the 15th century, when printers in Italy were printing for the first time Rashi's commentary on the Torah, they wanted to distinguish it from the text of the Torah itself. And so they put the text of the Torah in square font, and they put the commentary in this cursive font, which was the handwriting that was typically used it was based on the handwriting that was used among Sephardim. Because of that association, it became known as Rashi script, but it historically has no connection to Rashi. It's a Sephardic cursive, semi-cursive script. Now, how does it get to the Maghreb? Well, since the 15th century, it is a hugely popular typeface for small text, for body text, it's in fact the most common in many presses. They reserve the square script for titles, but the body of whatever it is you're printing is often done in this semi-cursive script because it's considered easier to read, or it was considered easier to read, and it's closer to the handwriting of how people actually wrote. Of course, it would have been very familiar for readers in North Africa because it is quite close to the Sephardic handwriting that they would have been familiar with. Now, the last thing I'll say is these fonts, of course, these typefaces are by this point in the 19th century quite old. These typefaces are essentially the same designs that had been created already in the 15th or 16th centuries. There's not a lot of typographic innovation. These aren't new designs. They're being cast by different type foundries in Europe, to order from the same molds. But what that yields is an issue with Judeo-Arabic, which is like Yiddish, like many Jewish vernacular languages. There are sounds in Judeo-Arabic which don't exist in Hebrew. For example, the jim, or the letter chayin, or the letter dod, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you indicate those sounds? So if you look at the earliest examples of printed Judeo-Arabic, like from the early 19th century, different printers take different strategies because they don't have the letters, they don't have a special gimel to indicate that it's a jim. So sometimes they'll put a gimel with a little line after it, like a little apostrophe. Sometimes they'll put a little dot. Eventually, by the middle of the 19th century, if you look here at the top image, you can see that some letters have diamonds over them, right? That indicate, so for example, the beginning there on the left-hand side of the page, this is the beginning of Genesis. Fi awwal khalaq Allah as-sama wal ard. So the dot over the pay indicates that it's fa, the dot over the kaf indicates that it's cha, the dot over the what looks like a tzadi indicates that it's a dod, et cetera, et cetera. So this is these are fonts that have now been adapted specifically for the purposes of printing Judeo-Arabic. And that's something that you see both in square fonts and also in Rashi fonts, that toward the second half of the 19th century, there's this typographic adaptation as printers are expanding into this new linguistic market.
Right. Okay. I have to be very careful about time tonight. Okay, we still have a little bit of time. Someone wanted to know, did the relative ease of printing Hebrew characters over Arabic play any role in helping to sustain Judeo-Arabic? Because you mentioned last week that it was harder to create a form and a font for Arabic.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. Like this guy Gedge, for example, advertises. He says, "I wish to inform you that I have a press in which we can produce books in Judeo-Arabic or in," he says, "bil Yahud," meaning Jewish Arabic, and bil Muslimin, meaning Muslim Arabic. Now, did he actually ever produce books in Arabic script? I actually find that hard to believe, and I've never seen any evidence that any of these Jewish printers actually ever printed in Arabic type. The ease of printing with Hebrew characters, I think, is for sure a large part of what allows Judeo-Arabic publishing to really kind of emerge. Within a few years, anybody, once they realized, we can print in Judeo-Arabic, they didn't have to figure out, well, how are we going to do it? The way that Arabic printers have to really kind of struggle through the technological, like, how are we going to print in Arabic? With Judeo-Arabic, they sort of decide they want to print Judeo-Arabic, and then they can use the Hebrew fonts that they already have, as I said, with some slight adaptations. Outside of the Jewish world, though, what I will say is it's not uncommon, especially in the early modern period, like in the 1600s and even in the 1700s, to see printers in Europe, like learned, scholarly printers. Often they want to print something in Arabic, but they don't have Arabic type. So what they use is Hebrew type, and they just print it as if it were Judeo-Arabic, even though sometimes what they're printing are like scholarly editions of, there's a scholarly edition of like a 14th century Arabic astronomical text, which was not written in Judeo-Arabic at all. It was written by a Muslim author, but the printer who wanted to publish it he printed it in quote unquote Judeo-Arabic, because he just put it in Hebrew type, because you can transfer unlike Yiddish, for example, right? Arabic and Hebrew share a linguistic underlay. So the Arabic aleph is the same letter as the Hebrew aleph. They're not written the same way, but like it's a letter for letter correspondence, right? Alif is aleph, ba is a bet, jim is a gimel. So you can transliterate an Arabic text letter by letter into the Hebrew equivalent, and presto, you've got a Judeo-Arabic text, in the way that I don't think you couldn't do that with German. You can't create Yiddish by taking each German letter and switching it for a Hebrew equivalent. That's not quite how it works. So.
Yeah, because there's Judeo-German that's not Yiddish, but let's just leave that aside right now.
That's what I'm saying is that.
Yeah. Let's leave that aside. That's fascinating. There's some other questions, but I want to invite you to continue.
Sure.
And we'll hopefully get to those questions, or there'll be new ones, but certainly you'll get to them because I'll send them to you. But let's move on. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. So that's actually a great segue, because the questions that we have been talking about lead me into really what I want to explore, which really centers around the question of language. Why were Maghrebi Jews publishing in Judeo-Arabic? What did it mean to them to create a Judeo-Arabic printing industry? So on one level, Judeo-Arabic was the common vernacular, and some Maghrebi writers used it simply because it was the language that people spoke. So for example, Shlomo Zarka and Yehuda Darmon, authors of a Judeo-Arabic biblical commentary published in Algiers in 1854, that you see here, called Shaila Mora, explain that they chose, in their preface, they chose to write this book not in Hebrew, nor in the classical Judeo-Arabic like Maimonides or Saadia Gaon, but rather, they say, in the Arabic language spoken in our time, in order to benefit the masses, so that any person whom the Exalted One has not enabled to read books in the Holy Tongue, meaning in Hebrew, if they haven't had the education to read in Hebrew, they can read this book and understand it and take pride in our precious faith. And therefore we have written this book in this corrupted Arabic language of ours, بهذا اللسان العربي المشوباش, so that anyone who reads it can understand it. So this apologetic approach for having to work in what they saw as an inferior, regionally specific, and corrupted language actually mirrors, in some way, similar anxieties among some Eastern European Jewish writers of the period and their relationship to Yiddish, which also was seen by some as a type of jargon that was a corrupted and inferior form of German. And its limitations. So we see that some writers take this approach to Judeo-Arabic. However, and again, this is also true for Yiddish, other authors choose purposefully to write in Judeo-Arabic with the goal of transforming it into a modern, locally rooted but globally aware Jewish language. In this role, it had two main competitors. On the one hand, Hebrew, valorized by proponents of the Haskalah, as a language of transnational Jewish unity, and on the other hand, French, which was linked to the power of the European colonial apparatus and the prestige of European modernity, and also being promoted specifically among Jews by universalizing Jewish educational philanthropic organizations from Europe, chief among them something called the Alliance Israélite Universelle, or the AIU, which we'll come back to in a moment. In this respect, let's take a look at this newspaper here. This is from Oran from 1889. Take a look and see if you can read the very top line of the title. So the title of the newspaper is called Tov LeYisrael, but what does it say on the top? If you can take a guess, put it in the chat. See if anybody got it. Okay, well, Dr. Sinkoff got it. Vive la France et l'Algérie. Right? Long live France and Algeria. And then, Tov li Israel, good news for the Jews, you might say in Hebrew. And then Judeo-Arabic. Yachraj kal yom il-Khamis comes out every Thursday, and then the rest of the newspaper, and so on and so forth. But this is I love this illustration, right? Hebrew characters, the entire page, right, is Hebrew characters, and yet 3 languages, at least, illustrating the tension and even ambivalence facing Judeo-Arabic writers and readers at the end of the 19th century, caught between the push and pull of multiple languages and the different affiliations that they represent. Already in 1870, when a certain Nissim Benisti established the first Maghrebi Judeo-Arabic newspaper, a short-lived bilingual French and Judeo-Arabic journal in Algiers titled Adziri in Judeo-Arabic and L'Israélite Algérien in French, it described itself as and I quote from its header, a commercial, industrial, agricultural, maritime, literary, scientific, judicial, and advertising journal. Its first headline declared reform, emancipation, and progress. The Judeo-Arabic language here is promoted as a potential equal to French, here it is, Adziri, in expressing the needs of modernity in all of its commercial, industrial, agricultural, maritime, literary, and scientific facets. But its writers still felt a deficiency, in some cases quite keenly, when measured against French. Even the Judeo-Arabic writing in Adziri contains a significant proportion of transliterated French words. We can see that here. Rédacteur, Shlomo de Yitzhak ben Hayun, editor, right? There's no word for editor in Judeo-Arabic, so they've just transliterated the French word rédacteur. The editor of Adziri, Nissim Benisti, himself acknowledged that we, quote, we Algerians must be initiated into this path of modernization gradually. We must first accustom ourselves to understanding some basic ideals in this Jewish Arabic language, which despite being our mother tongue has neither rules of grammar nor any systematic organization. A dialect which has served only for our commercial needs, it is still difficult to express any sort of deep idea with it. So again, this kind of apologetic hope that Judeo-Arabic cannot yet express the deep ideas of modern life. But for people like Benisti, by building a cohort of modern readers in Judeo-Arabic, he hoped to move it in the direction that French already represented for him. Other Judeo-Arabic writers and publishers, however, felt a need to produce Judeo-Arabic books not as an evolution toward French, a gradual evolution toward French, but rather as a bulwark against it. For example, a rabbi named Mordechai Tzoror, who authored a collection of stories in Judeo-Arabic in 1884 called Sasson, which was published here, you see, in Algiers, in his introduction, he writes that he is explicitly concerned with changing patterns of readership and losing Jewish readers to French. He writes that people are buying the books of the stories of the Christians, les romans, right, novels. And even the people who do buy newspapers buy them not to read the news, but so that they can read the stories, the feuilleton in them. Therefore, Tzoror says, I have merited to make this book in Arabic so that everyone can study the stories of the miracles and wonders that the Holy Blessed One has done for our ancestors. And even if they only learn from it the lesson of fearing the Holy Blessed One, they will still have a good reward. In other words, the issue is not necessarily with the content of the reading material or even whether or not the reader understands its deep ideas, but with the cultural implications of abandoning or adopting Judeo-Arabic versus French. So Tzoror, we might say, expressed or held the belief that Judeo-Arabic is just as capable as French in satisfying the needs of modern Jewish life, and that French, we don't need it. And in each of their ways, these writers claim participation in the modernity of their Francophone peers, but aim to transmit it in a purely Jewish idiom. Tzoror, at this time, joins forces with another local rabbi, who I mentioned already, Shalom Bekash, who had previously worked in Livorno, to open their own publishing house in Algiers. This press published a weekly Judeo-Arabic periodical called Beit Yisrael, with news from Jewish communities around the world. It published a wide variety of Judeo-Arabic books, works of science and geography, liturgy, ethics, history, and so on and so forth. For example, you see here on the right a book called Sipurei Hateva, Stories of Nature, which promises, quote, histories of the things which happened in the world in ancient times and all the things of the natural world. And anyone who reads this book will learn many things about nature that they do not previously know, since they have been copied from the books of many learned scientists. Now, I should also point out that many of these same presses and even some of the same writers who are publishing this kind of forward-thinking, secular, global, modernist literature are also publishing books of halacha, liturgy, and ethics aimed at combating Jewish assimilation and limiting French participation in French secular society. So, and this speaks to the complex position of Maghrebi Jewish thinkers negotiating their own path toward Judeo-Arabic modernity. And this, I think, is part of a distinctly North African flavor of the Jewish Maskilic movement or the Jewish Haskalah. Bekash, for example, certainly considered himself a participating member of the Haskalah. He describes himself as a maskil in the books that he publishes, and he himself not only subscribed to, but even occasionally wrote articles for Maskilic Jewish newspapers in Europe, like Hamelitz and Hamagid and Hatzfirah. But at the same time, Bekash was also a community rabbi and invested in traditional Jewish spirituality and religious life. In fact, many of the most prominent Judeo-Arabic publishers also held roles in Jewish religious leadership. So they're balancing that alongside a commitment to the social and political implications of vernacular, maybe secular, Judeo-Arabic literature. So the question of whether Judeo-Arabic literature is really secular or not is one of the things we have to grapple with. But there is another player on the linguistic board game. The French language was making rapid inroads among the Jewish communities of the Maghreb in the second half of the 19th century, and it grew to dominate the linguistic world of Maghrebi Jews, not only through the expansion of French colonialism, but especially through the work of the Franco-Jewish philanthropic organization, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, founded in 1860. AIU educators generally disapproved of and discouraged the use of Judeo-Arabic, seeing it, correctly, I would argue, as one of the most powerful cultural factors that tied Maghrebi Jews to their Muslim neighbors and thus hampered their assimilatory project of, quote unquote, regenerating Arab Jews away from Arabness and toward European modernity. The AIU educator Moïse Nahon, for example, who himself was originally from northern Morocco, lamented in 1903 that the once great intellectual life of the Sephardi exiles had been lost among the centuries of Jewish degeneration in their Arab environment. And he proposes reviving the Jewish communities of the Orient, shriveled from centuries of neglect, by chasing Arabic out of the study house and synagogue and replacing it with French. Some Maghrebi Maskilim, however, felt that French threatened what they felt should be the two real languages of Maghrebi Jews, Hebrew for the universalist aspect and Judeo-Arabic for their Maghrebi aspect. So, for example, the Tunisian maskil and journalist Shalom Flach, who published widely in both Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic, bemoaned the dominance of French language education from the Alliance in Tunis, writing in 1888 that the goal of the AIU was to turn our children into complete Frenchmen, and that French literature has filled up all the space of their brains, and so how could Hebrew reading find favor with them? Others attempted to reach something of a compromise between balancing Hebrew and French and Judeo-Arabic. Mordechai Tzaror, the very same rabbi who lambasted Algerian Jews for buying French feuilletons in Kol Sasson in 1884, remember from just a few slides ago, the same rabbi, just 2 years later, published his own French translation of the Passover Haggadah, his name Gallicized on the title page from Mordechai to Martin. Martin Saror Rabbin, printed in Livorno, it should be said, but sponsored by his Algerian business partner, Avraham Boukabza, and sold quite widely in his bookstore in Algiers, whose address appears on the very next page. Now, Of course, the religious content of a Passover Haggadah is obviously different from a secular temptation of the French feuilletons. But still, Saror's integration of his commitment to traditional Jewish practice, his support of Judeo-Arabic publishing, and his appreciation of, let's say, the professional advantages of the French language suggest the possibility of standing simultaneously in Judeo-Arabic, Hebrew, and French worlds. Likewise, in Netzach Yisrael, a collection of Judeo-Arabic essays published in Tunis in 1888, the authors glorify a vision of the harmonious integration of rationality, symbolized by the living language of French, and faith, symbolized by Israelite knowledge and its language, which maybe is Hebrew, maybe Judeo-Arabic, or both. But the goal is to articulate an integrated Jewish identity that draws on all of its roots in Hebrew, Judeo-Arabic, and French, all, as they say, brothers to a single mother. So Jewish communities in colonial North Africa found themselves increasingly working or struggling, as the century drew on, to balance their ties to their local surroundings, meaning their Arabic-speaking Muslim neighbors, their orientation toward France, meaning the French colonial system that structured their lives, and the larger Jewish world, represented primarily by the French Jewish society, towards which at least some of them aspired. This balance did not last long. Already in 1909, the French Jewish linguist Marcel Cohen, who spent 5 months in Algiers between 1908 and 1909, noted a widespread disappearance of Judeo-Arabic texts and speech patterns in favor of French. In 1910, the Zionist writer Nahum Slush noted on a trip to Tunis that, and I quote, "The Gallicizing process has gone forward rapidly, and the new generation, industrious and very much alive, rapidly throws off the Arab influence, and only the older people still cling to their Judeo-Arabic literature." Tunisian Jewish printers began in the early 20th century to print Judeo-Arabic works accompanied or even replaced by transliteration in Latin letters, indicating that some Jews might still be able to understand Judeo-Arabic, but were not interested or comfortable in reading it in Hebrew script, like these song booklets that you see here. And while we're on the topic of music, I should note that music was one of the fields which was most strongly expressive of the synthesis of Jewish and Arab Muslim cultures, with tunes and lyrics moving back and forth, and artists playing together in mixed ensembles, as shown in the work of scholars like my colleague Chris Silver. You should all read his book on Jewish musicians in North Africa. The most significant documentation of this shared repertoire, Edmond Yaffil's 1904 musicological encyclopedia, Diwan al-Aghani, was published, as you see on the right-hand side, in 3 simultaneous editions in Judeo-Arabic, Arabic, and French. But this book was, in some ways, the last gasp of a world that by the early 20th century was already disappearing. Over the course of the 20th century, Maghrebi Jewish presses turned to producing most and eventually all of their works in French. And then, of course, the market for Maghrebi Jewish books was devastated for obvious reasons by the mass departure of Jewish communities from the Maghreb, beginning with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and continuing after the various battles for national independence in the Maghreb, concluding for Morocco and Tunisia in 1956 and Algeria in 1962. On the whole, I would say that the 19th century promise of a modern Judeo-Arabic literary and intellectual world in North Africa was never fully realized, unlike, for example, in Iraq or Egypt, where Jews participated much more actively in the development of modern Arabic literature. But I want to conclude, however, by rewinding and looking back to one last historical example of the possibilities that Judeo-Arabic books held to bring people together across communities and boundaries. At the beginning of the talk, I mentioned the Shaliach Chaim Ze'ev Ashkenazi, who brought the first Jewish press to the Maghreb, and I mentioned that he continued to Tunis in 1861. There, he partnered with a local scholar named Moshe Shamama to print a very unusual book that you see here, Kitab Qanun ad-Dawla at-Tunisiya, the book of the Constitution of the Tunisian state. The original text was the first formal Tunisian constitution. In fact, it was the first written constitution to be adopted anywhere in the modern Arab world. It had been assembled over the course of a few years by a committee following an international scandal. In 1857, in Tunis, a Jew was executed for blasphemy against Islam, and European consuls were horrified, pressuring the Tunisian government to safeguard the rights of religious minorities. And when a new bey rose to power in 1859, he set up a group of Tunisian reformers and politicians to draft the text of a new constitution, which was proclaimed in January 1861. One of the major features of this constitution was its emphasis on secular legal equality, stating, for example, and I quote, that all the subjects of the Tunisian kingdom, no matter to what religion they belong, have the right to complete security regarding their persons, their property, and their honor. This was a sharp departure from the traditional legal status of Jews in Islamic states, which extended them certain protections under Islamic law as a tolerated minority, but which nonetheless maintained a legal hierarchy that prioritized Muslim rights over non-Muslims. Shamama's Judeo-Arabic translation of the Qanun, which was the first Jewish book printed in modern Tunisia, was published in April 1861, the very same month that the Qanun itself took effect. In his preface, Shamama emphasizes its importance for his community to learn to be modern Tunisian citizens. When he realized, he says, that many members of the Jewish community, uneducated in classical Arabic, would be unable to read the Qanun for themselves, he took it upon himself to render a translation of this text that so directly held the potential to transform Jewish life. Its cornerstones and articles, he writes, are about the differences in religions and how those differences will now be respected in this new Tunisia. He even added an index at the end for ease of reference. This was the kind of book, he seems to imply, that one should carry around in their pocket. His goal in printing this book was for his community to understand both their new duties and their new rights as citizens for the first time. Through printing and through the Judeo-Arabic book, they could respond to and participate in their political moment as Jews in a rapidly changing modern world. I cannot help but dwell on the bittersweet hope that this document represents. Bittersweet for two reasons. First, unfortunately, this Tunisian constitution didn't last very long. Provincial populations outside Tunis, angered by changes in the tax system that this reform promised and threatened by the challenges to their traditional religious and ethnic privilege, broke out in revolt in 1864, and the constitution was suspended. Although the revolt was repressed after a year of bloody uprisings and battles, the damage had been done, and the constitution was never reinstated. After a few more years of political chaos, the French invaded in 1881 and established the colonial protectorate that lasted until 1956. The second reason, of course, is the fragile state of our own constitutional democracy, battered and abused at this very moment. So I think of how this document emerged out of violence and conflict 150 years ago, and how it allowed one community to envision, even if briefly, a different kind of future for their nation, characterized by both social diversity and equality under the law. I can only hope that the forces of human conscience and emancipation that run through our history will once again lead us to imagine new possibilities for our future. Thank you, and thank you all for joining me on this course.
Noam, thank you so much. So much rich material, and I think it's fair to say that most people know very little about this, and I think you've whet everyone's appetite in terms of just the creativity of printing, of bookmaking, of Judeo-Arabic. Also, this thing called the Maghrebi diaspora, which I find fascinating. I often emphasize, in the teaching of Jewish history, people always reference diaspora to 70 CE, which is important. I would never dismiss its centrality. But what you find is then Jews, exiles, refugees, however you want to refer to them, then make their homes in other places, other regions. And then when they leave those regions, they bring with them another, like a nested diasporism, right? A nested diasporism. And this idea that Maghrebi Jews have an identity even when they end up in Italy or later in the 19th and 20th century in places like Montreal and,
Of course.
Mandate
Yeah,
Palestine and other
absolutely.
places in the world. So I think that's really fascinating. I also found it, and I'm sure maybe you've written about it, but other people have too, this sort of disparagement or this apologetic tone about these vernacular languages, right? When they're up against what they perceive as these classic languages. In the Ashkenazic context, it's Hebrew as the classic language, and then of course German
Yeah.
as the language of culture. And in your case, in the Maghrebi, North African, it's Hebrew to some degree, but also French, right? And of course, it's partly associated with state power too. Who's calling the shots is the colonial power, or in the case of Ashkenazic Jews, the Prussian Empire, and then later the Russian Empire, right? This state language has become kind of exalted. So I found that you find it so much, oh, I don't really know Yiddish, or, Yiddish is for women. So
Mhm,
that's a
mhm.
question I have, and someone else has a
Yeah.
question about
About
gender.
gender. Yeah.
Was
Yeah.
there ever an association with Judeo-Arabic as the women's language, the way there was with Yiddish? Yiddish was for women or men who are like women, meaning they're illiterate in
Yeah.
Hebrew.
It's a
Or do we
great
not have
question.
that gendered?
It's a great question, and the answer is sort of yes and no. Um, the big issue, and this is one of the differences between Judeo-Arabic literature and Yiddish literature. Um, Women in North Africa, Jewish women in North Africa, almost universally, obviously there are a few exceptions, but almost universally were not taught to read even the Hebrew alphabet. If they said prayers, they said them by heart. And if they went to synagogue, which they often did not do, they just went and sat and listened. Uh, so what you have is you do have Judeo-Arabic texts that are written for women, but what you get is, and we have like in the preface, for example, it'll say, every man should buy this book and read it to his wife so that she can understand, the laws of kashrut, or that so she can understand the stories of the Torah. So there are these vernacular adaptations, but they're transmitted orally. So we have to think about also the book not just as a singular, like somebody sitting and reading silently, but actually books are nodes for community gatherings. And we know, for example, people would bring a book to a cafe or a journal to a cafe, right? You got one copy of the newspaper and they stand up on the chair and they read it aloud and everybody in the cafe can listen to it. And that crosses, age, gender, and also ethnic origin, because when you read Judeo-Arabic aloud, Arabic speakers, for the most part, can understand it. So you also have stories where we have accounts of, Muslims and Jews in a cafe listening to Judeo-Arabic literature aloud. But in terms of gender, so the interesting thing that happens is, so you have these sort of women's Judeo-Arabic texts that are mediated through men's reading. And then, as the 19th century goes on, after the introduction of the Alliance, one of the things that the Alliance does very strongly is promote female literacy. But of course, they're not interested in having anybody read in Judeo-Arabic. So they teach all the girls to read French. And so very quickly, French actually becomes gendered. That women are much more likely, and this is true, for example, like with English in the Hasidic world, right?
I was
Women,
about to say it's exactly parallel. That
women
somehow, yeah.
in North Africa, already by the late 19th century, many of them are very proficient in French. And in fact, the very first published writing that we have from Maghrebi Jewish women is in French. I believe me, I looked. I did not find a single example of a female author writing in Judeo-Arabic in North Africa. Uh, but they do start writing in French quite early. So that you have this kind of French, there are like women's literary clubs already in the late 19th century who have like libraries of, Voltaire and Zola and like, they're Molière, they're like reading Molière, in French in Tangiers, in like 1897. So yeah.
I'm not giving you work to do, but it would be interesting, and maybe someone's done it, I know this in the Yiddish context. So Anita Norwich, great scholar of Yiddish literature, has also done a class for us, went through the daily press and found serialized novels and other things written by women. And that was a way. So, I mean, one
It,
wonders, but
it's a
the
huge
Judeo-Arabic press is under is
so
being
this
challenged by
it's
the, you know,
it's being challenged, but there is a very significant, brief window. But there is a window in which, as I said, you have dozens of Judeo-Arabic newspapers. Many of them are short-lived. They sort of publish for a few years and then they fold. But these newspapers are almost completely untapped. Just in the last maybe 10 years, not even, 5, 10 years, people have started to work on them. In no small part because actually until 5 or 10 years ago, they were completely inaccessible because they survived only in very few copies. But now, especially through the National Library of Israel's digitization project,
right. The historical Jewish
the
press
Historical
is
Jewish Press
unbelievable.
Project, there are
Right.
now a dozen Judeo-Arabic newspapers that people can sit and read. So I have several, it's not, I'm working on other things at the moment, maybe I'll come back to it, but I have several colleagues who are now starting to go through and mine the Judeo-Arabic press of the late 19th century to try to see, what are people talking about? What are people, and so yeah, I don't think anybody's yet found any Judeo-Arabic women writing, but they could be out there. It could be out there. We wouldn't know unless we start working on it.
Right. So that's actually another question, and this will be our last question. Why, you made an aside, why is there a lack? And now you just talked about people being interested, but why has there been a lack of interest in Judeo-Arabic?
Um,
Is that
why is there like, yeah? So I would say first of all, up until recently, mainly until the, let's say, until the 1990s, early 2000s. I think there's a few reasons. The first reason is uh, in Judeo-Arabic, right? In order to read Judeo-Arabic, you need to know Arabic. So people who studied Arabic, Arabists, right, we might call them, up until the 20th century, were primarily interested in the medieval world. Uh, there was this, and this is part of like a larger historiography that sees the Middle Ages as the golden age of Islam, the golden age of Arabic literature, the golden age of the Middle East, and that everything that happened in the Middle East after the 16th century is a story of decline, and that there's nothing interesting and there's nothing worth happening, and there's no history in North Africa or in the Middle East after the 17th century. So, and we see these kind of dismissive comments from writers, scholars, academics, Arabists, even in the early 20th century, who say things like, I came across this Arabic, Judeo-Arabic book published in 1880 whatever in Tunis, and it's sort of an amusing curiosity to see the transcription of the dialect, but it has no redeeming intellectual or literary value, right? So it's just a cute kind of curious thing. So that's the first reason. And the second reason, I think, has to do with the unique political place that Judeo-Arabic finds itself caught between the Jewish and Arab worlds after 1948. So what happens, and this primarily I'm talking about what happens in Israel, right, is because of the events of the mid-20th century, the Arabic language becomes very strongly, for obvious reasons, strongly associated in Israeli society with the enemy, the Arabs. So Jews who speak Arabic are in this ambiguous position, and many of them feel pressure, sometimes explicit and often implicit pressure, to abandon the Arabic language as part of their assimilation into Israeli society. And I'll tell you a story. When I started studying Judeo-Arabic in Israel 15 years ago, this was a college course, an introduction to Judeo-Arabic at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And there's college students and there's me, and the woman sitting next to me is like my mother's age. So that's unusual. So after the first class, I struck up a conversation with her and I said, are you auditing the class, or what's your story? And she explained to me that she was born in Israel in the 1950s. Her parents were immigrants from Algeria. They were native Arabic speakers, Judeo-Arabic speakers. And she said, when I was growing up in Israel, I was so ashamed to hear their, to hear their accent, because I from school, what I heard from my friends was the Arabs are our enemies. And I was so embarrassed that my own parents came from that world that when my friends came over from school, I told my parents, stay in the kitchen and don't say anything. So, and this is, the migration generational part of the story, this happens, of course, also with Yiddish, but there's an extra flavor, there's an extra layer here that the Arabic language had such danger associated with it that it was really almost impossible to get any kind of serious engagement with it, right? So like all of these people grew up without the knowledge of Judeo-Arabic, without seeing value in Judeo-Arabic, without the investment in preserving Judeo-Arabic. And then it was really only, so she said, she's now that her parents are gone, she said, I am devoting my life to the culture that I didn't appreciate. And so she's now finished her PhD and wrote a book about the dialect of Judeo-Arabic from the Algerian town that her parents came from, Constantine. She's now the expert on Judeo-Arabic of Constantine. So that's like a tikkun, like it's a kind of a repair that she's doing. So that's in the last 30 years, there's been this reorientation, not just in general, because we're looking for new things to study, but I think because there's this realization that Judeo-Arabic holds some alternative that has political value, or that has intellectual value, or that offers some expansion of possibilities that we might need in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk a lot about that. I'm happy to talk to anyone about that. I think it's very interesting inflected moment where these endangered diasporic Jewish languages are finding their champions for a whole host of reasons. Yeah, someone just wrote about Yiddish, so there we go. Yes, so we could talk a lot about it, but it's 8:07, so we can't. I want to thank you so much, Noam, for this wonderful three-part class. I know how much our audience appreciated it. We had 90 people at the beginning. We have 60 people now. It's cold, it's wintry. People want to do other things. So it's a great testament to your erudition and your enthusiasm for this material. I've sent you under separate cover some questions. People know to write to the Bildner Center if they have others. I want to thank Karen Small, as always, the managing director of the Bildner Center, who oversees all of what we do, keeps me honest. Thank you, Karen. I want to thank Robin Auerbach, also program coordinator, who again is on the ground, always making sure that everything works, make the technology, the recordings, everything like that. To Darcy Marr, our communications specialist, who makes sure that people know about all the programming of the Bildner Center. I want to remind everyone that February 9th, we have another virtual class, lecture one day by a former Rutgers PhD, Dr. Melissa Clapper, entitled Not Just a Pleasure Trip, American Jewish Women's Travel to Mandate Palestine in the Early 20th Century, from her forthcoming book on Jewish women and travel in the interwar period. And then on Monday night, March 23rd, my colleague in the history department, distinguished professor of history, Jochen Helbeck, will be talking about his new book, World Enemy Number One, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Fate of the Jews. I know it will be an extraordinary talk. So I look forward to seeing you virtually and in person. And I want to thank Dr. Noam Sienna again, and thank all of you for your support of the Bildner Center programs in participation and in, financial support as well. I ask you for it. I'm not shy, because we can't do what we do without that. So thank you very much. Good night, everyone. Stay warm. And I will see you virtually on February 9th.